Good day. Today, as yesterday in my video, I propose to focus principally on the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, though I will have some things to say about the situation in the Middle East in the second half of this program. Well, yesterday, perhaps in terms of the conflict in Ukraine, the news was dominated by rumours, escalating rumours of a deepening political crisis in Kiev, of generals being sacked, of plots and conspiracies, of lots of talk of potential coups, all sorts of things of that kind. And the day came and went with these rumours and reports circulating, by the way, extensively in the Ukrainian media. The day came and went, and at the end of it, everybody was still in the same position that they had been at the start of the day. So lots of rumours, but very little actually visibly taking place. So what were these rumours? Well, first of all, there were rumours that 3 Ukrainian generals were about to be sacked. The report claimed, and it was a report that was supported by various members of the Rada, that is to say, members of the Ukrainian parliament. They came out and essentially spoke about these rumours as if they were true. Anyway, and also the rumours appeared in parts of the Ukrainian media, including Strana, which is a website, independent media website, actually a very good website if you want to keep a close eye on Ukrainian news. Anyway, in all of these places there was lots of talk that 3 generals specifically were in line to be sacked. And one of them was General Tarnavsky, whom I've discussed before, and have in the past suggested that he might conceivably be a potential replacement for General Zaluzhny. It seemed to me at one time that the Western media was very busy promoting him, building him up as the commander who was going to break through on the southern front lines and seize the Sea of Azov. I should say that Tarnavsky has headed Ukraine's territorial defense forces. These are reservists who have been called up over the course of this war, this conflict, who've been enlisted into what are basically fairly lightly armed divisions. And though they are divisions which, or rather brigades, which however do participate actively in the fighting, in the war that takes place in Ukraine, but they are basically mobilization brigades, and the people who serve in the territorial defense forces are troops who have been mobilized and who are of a certain age and who do not perhaps have the full levels of training that regular Ukrainian infantry had, at least at the start of the war. So General Tarnavsky was the head of this service, and perhaps more pertinently and importantly, in terms of recent events, he was also the commander of the Tavrida group, which is essentially the southern group of forces which have been conducting the offensive in Zaporozhye region, who were tasked with the mission of breaking through the Russian defense lines, the Surovikin line, capturing Tokmak and then Melitopol, and advancing from there to the Sea of Azov and breaking the Russian land bridge to Crimea, the main task of Ukraine's summer offensive. So General Tarnavsky, according to the rumours, he was going to be sacked. And another Ukrainian general, whom I will say straight away, I know very little about, never heard of before, he was also due to be sacked. And from what I can understand, he was the general who was in overall command of Ukrainian forces in the north, along the borders with Belarus and Russia. This has been a relatively quiet area in the war over the last couple of months, though it is important to say that the Russians do regularly launch artillery strikes on Ukrainian positions across the border, and Russian reconnaissance groups also regularly cross the border into Ukraine and carry out various raiding missions there, though they never get perhaps the attention that analogous Ukrainian reconnaissance and raiding groups do when they enter into Russia and conduct their operations in other places. Anyway, this particular general, he also supposedly was going to be sacked, though quite why, it's not entirely clear to me, since, as I said previously, this part of the front line has been relatively quiet. And a third Ukrainian general supposedly was also going to be sacked. Now, this particular general is a woman, and she is in overall charge of the military's medical services. And here, perhaps, a sacking might make a little more sense. There's been lots of complaints that the military medical services in Ukraine have not been up to scratch, that they've not provided the soldiers, the wounded soldiers, with the treatment, the emergency evacuation that they require, that the hospitals in the rear are not properly provided with equipment, doctors, and that the field stations are not adequately organised and supplied either. And given that there's been these criticisms, some of which, by the way, I've discussed in earlier programmes on this channel, well, it's perhaps not surprising that this particular general supposedly was also going to be sacked. I would quickly say, in parenthesis, that, of course, even if this general who was running the medical services had been the world's most talented organizer, and I'm not saying she is, but even if she had been, one can only do so much with limited resources. And my overall impression is that the problem with Ukraine's medical services, as with so much else, is that Ukraine simply doesn't have the resources to operate them effectively. But anyway, there were lots of rumours that these three generals were going to be sacked, and in Tarnavsky's case, one can see why. The Zaporozhye offensive, which he supervised, has been a total failure. It failed to break through the Surovikin line. It did not capture Tokmak or reach Melitopol, much less the Sea of Azov. So, logically, it'd be understandable if Tarnavsky were dismissed. And, as I said, the chief medical officer, one can see why she might have been dismissed as well. But anyway, those rumours were circulating, and there were also other rumours as well, which was that the Ukrainian defense minister, Rustem Umarov, who, as well as being a Crimean Tatar politician, it turns out is politically and personally very close to President Zelensky. He was one of the lead negotiators in the negotiations with the Russians that took place in February and March last year, which I discussed extensively in yesterday's program. Anyway, Rustem Umarov, who's also apparently at one time served as Zelensky's national security advisor. It was said that he was also preparing or pursuing a criminal probe of no less a person than General Zaluzhny and other senior Ukrainian officers because of their supposed dereliction of duty in the early months of the conflict in February and March of last year, resulting in Russia's rapid capture of Kherson region, including the regional capital, Kherson city. Now, there's been reports about this investigation before. There's even were reports a couple of weeks ago that General Zaluzhny had been questioned by the investigators who are conducting this probe, a misconceived probe in legal terms, so it seems to me, if ever there was one. But anyway, given that talk about this probe was being resurrected in conjunction with all of these rumours about the sacking of all of these generals, the overall impression that one started to get over the course of the day was that President Zelensky, deeply insecure in his position, as he doubtless is, was taking preemptive steps to decapitate, in effect, the entire Ukrainian military leadership, perhaps to avert some kind of a coup. At least that was how it was being presented in various places. And then the day wore on, and we got no news about any of these sackings. And eventually, rather belatedly, long after these coups had been swirling around, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry published a statement saying that there were no plans to sack any generals, and this was all fake news. Now, in conjunction with all of these rumours of plots, conspiracies, dismissals, purges in Kiev, there have also been reports, and again I haven't been able to confirm these, but I suspect that they are true, that William Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, is flying to Kiev tomorrow, and that he will have talks with senior members of the Ukrainian government. And unsurprisingly and inevitably, people are linking all of these events together. We're talking about a political crisis in Kiev. They're speculating that Burns is going to come with a demand that Zelensky take urgent steps to freeze the conflict with the Russians and perhaps begin some kind of negotiations with them, and that he will be given an implicit or perhaps even an express warning that if he doesn't, the United States will be looking for means to replace him. And it's assumed by many people that some of these preemptive steps to sack the generals were taken in anticipation of Burns' visit by a panicking Zelensky looking to shore up his position and to avert what might be a CIA-directed coup. Well, I think the first thing to say is that there clearly are tensions between Zelensky and his military high command. I mean, this has been rumoured for a long time. I first remember reading reports way back at the time of the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk fighting in the spring and early summer of last year, that there were tensions between Zaluzhny and Zelensky. And there were widespread reports at that time that Zaluzhny was unhappy with what he saw as some of these premature steps rather, by Zelensky to launch offensives. The offensives that eventually took place in the autumn of last year, the offensive in Kharkiv and the offensive in Kherson region. He felt that what Ukraine needed to do was to conserve and build up its forces and then launch its offensive focusing on Crimea this year rather than last. And I also remember that Gordon Hahn, one of the most astute and erudite of commentators on the topic of Ukraine, he actually republished a whole article written by General Zaluzhny last year, which seemed to confirm that this was indeed the case, that Zaluzhny had indeed been thinking in this way and presumably giving that advice, and that the autumn offensives, which are often credited to him and which some people in the West cite as examples of Zaluzhny's extraordinary military ability, anyway, that Zaluzhny in reality had not been keen on these offensives at all. So there is a long history of difficult relations between Zaluzhny and Zelensky, and there's no doubt at all that these have worsened very considerably as this year has dragged on. Zaluzhny has played a double game over the summer offensive, as by the way he has done over every other single important battle that there has been over the course of this conflict. On the one hand, he arranges through various sources to leak information to Ukrainian telegram channels and to the media, suggesting that he personally disagrees with some of Zelensky's strategies, that he doesn't agree with Zelensky's ideas for offensives, that he is skeptical of Zelensky's plans to defend every millimetre of ground, every town, village, city or hamlet that the Russians attack, that Zaluzhny has wanted a much more flexible, much more pragmatic approach to the war, and that he has been frustrated by Zelensky. So that is one version that Zaluzhny, and I've no doubt it is Zaluzhny himself, circulates through friendly telegram channels to the Ukrainian public, that he is the rational, professional military officer who is trying to argue back against this amateur, eccentric president who takes all the military decisions which invariably lead to disastrous outcomes. So that's one part of the game Zaluzhny has been playing. The other part is that he loyally does whatever Zelensky has asked him to do. He loyally does whatever the Western powers up to this point have asked him to do. And if it turns out right, as was the case with the Kharkiv offensive last year, for example, he claims credit for it. So he's been playing this double game, and perhaps unsurprisingly, one gets the sense that Zelensky has been getting increasingly irritated and exasperated by it. And I'm going to suggest that the famous interview that Zaluzhny gave to The Economist about 10 days ago is another example of this. On this occasion, since it was a Western publication, Zaluzhny had to come out into the open And of course, he did make some enormously important and interesting admissions. He accepted that the offensive, in effect, had failed. He talked about a stalemate. He gave all sorts of explanations, all sorts of painstaking explanations as to why the war was in a stalemate and why the offensive that he had been leading has failed to succeed. And he also, in effect, admitted that Ukraine is bogged down in a war of attrition and one which it is going to lose. So that was, again, what Zaluzhny was doing. But of course, if you read his short article for The Economist, if you read the interviews with him, if you looked at the comments that he has actually been making, as we have discussed on the Duran, Zaluzhny was also up to something else, which is, of course, since he was the overall officer in command, he has been busy constructing his alibi. It's not his fault that nothing turned out in the way that everyone expected. The plans were all scientifically worked out. Crimea ought to have been reached within 4 months and perhaps even occupied within that time. The reason things didn't turn out as intended and as Zaluzhny had said they would in an interview he gave to The Economist a year before was because technology has made that impossible, and the Russians have proved far more resilient in the face of losses than he himself had expected. So, in effect, what Zaluzhny was doing was he was creating an alibi, giving excuses to the West for his own failures. But of course, from Zelensky's point of view, this was a challenge to his authority. Here we have Zelensky busy trying to persuade Western governments to provide Ukraine with even more money, even more weapons, in order to prosecute the war even further. And we have Zaluzhny trying to preserve his reputation by giving an interview in which, however, he admits that Ukraine's offensive has failed, that the war is in what Zaluzhny calls stalemate, and that Ukraine is actually in a war of attrition, which it is going to lose. So you can understand why Zelensky must be absolutely furious with this, as must Zelensky's team. They're probably deeply frustrated and angry about the way in which Zaluzhny has been playing his double game with them for so long, in effect putting all blame and responsibility for everything that goes wrong on Zelensky, whilst keeping credit to himself for everything that goes right. They must have been extremely angry with that, and one can see why this interaction between Zaluzhny and The Economist must have tipped them over the edge. And so there's clearly been a huge build-up of tensions between Zelensky and his team and Zaluzhny. And into the middle of all of that, we had that extraordinary affair of Zaluzhny's chief of staff, as it apparently turned out he was, blown up on the occasion of his birthday party after he pulled the pin from a hand grenade that was supposedly provided to him as a present, a birthday present. And of course, I've already discussed extensively in my programs how most people in Ukraine, whether rightly or not, assumed that this was an assassination and perhaps a warning from Zelensky's team to Zaluzhny himself. Anyway, so you can see that there are these tensions. And previously, Time magazine, when it did that devastating piece on Zelensky, the one in which they described him as holed up in a bunker, becoming increasingly messianic and delusional, giving irrational orders and disobeyed by his officers. Anyway, in that same article, they did actually say that the Ukrainian leadership, Zelensky, are now planning to sack a senior general in order to foist upon that particular general responsibility for the failure of the offensive. So clearly, these stories about tensions between Zelensky and Zaluzhny have a strong basis in fact. It's highly likely that the relationship between the two men has, to all intents and purposes, collapsed. And it does seem also as if most of the Ukrainian field commanders are backing Zaluzhny, their military chief, over Zelensky in this quarrel. And I can imagine that in this kind of situation, Zelensky feeling increasingly insecure, and as that NBC article that I also discussed recently has confirmed to us, Zelensky feeling under pressure to find some way to bring this war to an end, pressure from the West to do that, told apparently that he has until the end of this year to find some means to do that. There's no clear explanation as to what that should be. But anyway, it would not be surprising if Zelensky, given this kind of pressure, conscious of the collapse of his electoral support in Ukraine, sensing that opinion in the West is turning against him, is now becoming increasingly paranoid about his generals and might be considering dismissing them. So this is not an implausible scenario. And of course there are actors, outside actors, who seem to be eager to keep the pot turning, to make things even more fraught in Kiev than perhaps they already are. So way back on the 4th of November, Nikolai Patrushev, President Putin's national security advisor, the secretary of Russia's extremely powerful Security Council, actually made a comment. He said that rational actors exist in Ukraine but are currently suppressed by Kiev. Now, it wasn't clear, of course, who he meant by that. He didn't identify any specific person. Some people assume that he is referencing here General Zaluzhny. I personally think that Patrushev was simply out to make mischief. He could see that relations between Zelensky and Zaluzhny are disintegrating. He could sense that there is a political crisis now developing in Kiev. And so he came out and made a comment like this, which he must have known would launch a whole series of guesses on the part of many people about possible Russian involvement in this crisis. And it's not surprising that that is something that Patrushev himself might want to do. Now, I noticed that some people, Dima, for example, at the Military Summary channel, are talking about the Russians seeking to win this war by instigating a coup in Kiev. And the implication is that the Russians do have contacts with some of the actors, political actors in Kiev, and that they're aiming, therefore, to launch some kind of coup against President Zelensky, that there's some broader Russian plan to launch some kind of massive missile offensive to knock out Ukraine's energy system. And as the situation becomes even more difficult and dangerous for Ukraine, that all of these disaffected generals and commanders, and potentially Zaluzhny himself, the people one presumes are the rational actors, would then step in, push Zelensky out of the way, assume power themselves, and reach some kind of deal with the Russians. I'm going to say straight away, I don't know whether or not plans like that do exist and what role, if any, the Russians have. But for the record, I don't personally think that the Russians have the necessary contacts in Kiev any longer to carry out a coup of that nature. I don't myself think that the Russians are in direct touch with Zaluzhny or with any other Ukrainian general. I think that the kind of people who might once have led a pro-Russian coup in Kiev have probably been purged by the system long ago. And I think that the Russians are simply sitting back and watching and perhaps enjoying what is going on in Kiev, but they're not directly involved in it and they're not participating in it. But Patrushev, of course, who is a shrewd and guileful person, he is after all a former intelligence officer, knows well how to make people think otherwise. This is my own view. And I also happen to think that despite the tensions at the moment in Kiev, I think that none of the sides involved are at the moment in a position to take steps against the other. I suspect what happened yesterday is that there were indeed plans to sack Ukrainian generals, but I think that the Ukrainian generals pushed back. I think Zaluzhny himself, who probably saw the potential sackings of these generals as, in effect, preparation for the sacking of himself, backed these generals. And I think that Zelensky and Umarov, in Zelensky's case, given with his weakening support amongst the wider Ukrainian public, had no choice but to back off. So I think that if there was a plan to sack the generals, as I think perhaps there was, I think after a lot of rumour, a lot of discussion, a lot of pushback, Zelensky probably was forced to back down. I think the same applies from the other side also. Now, I noticed that even as these rumours were swirling around yesterday, there was one commentary from a Ukrainian political commentator bringing up again the events in South Vietnam. Quite clearly what was being referenced was the coup in 1963 against President Diem. When President Diem, who was widely seen as increasingly irrational, lost the confidence of the United States and of most of the military when that happened, with the green light of the United States. Military units in the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, moved against him, launched a coup, and Diem was overthrown and then murdered immediately afterwards. But I have to say that in the Ukrainian case, I think that by now this is probably a difficult thing to pull off. President Zelensky has been represented to the world, to the people of the United States, to the people of Britain, as this almost legendary figure, heroically leading the Ukrainian people in their resistance to the Russians. And in addition, the United States and Britain, especially, and Germany too, have gone to great lengths to portray this as a conflict between Russia's autocracy and Ukraine's supposed democracy. And it's very difficult to see how a coup in Kiev, illegally removing by violent force an incumbent democratically elected president, fits into either one of these narratives. And yesterday I discussed how engineering a coup of that nature might also create a crisis of confidence amongst the Ukrainian military, the soldiers on the front lines, and visible signs of that kind of event, those sort of events in Kiev might potentially undermine the war effort. So I think that for the moment, Zelensky isn't strong enough to sack his generals. He risks an effective mutiny in which they collectively refuse to accept his sacking if he tries to do it. And the generals, even if they've lost all patience and respect for him, probably aren't yet in a position to strike against him and to remove him. And I think that the administration in Washington, which must be very conscious of these problems in Kiev, I personally think that the primary reason they sent Burns to Kiev is precisely so that he can calm the situation down. Far from him going there in order to persuade Zelensky to step down, I think that what Burns is going to try to do is try to persuade everybody, Zelensky and Zaluzhny and all of the others, to back off, to at least preserve the outward appearance of a politically and militarily united team. That doesn't mean, of course, that Burns isn't going to come with warnings to Zelensky. It's becoming increasingly clear to me that in the United States, at least, support for the continued funding of Ukraine and for the continued supply of weapons to Ukraine is now in a state of progressive collapse. Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, said that the United States is now almost out of funds and resources to continue to support Ukraine. He blamed this all on the Republicans in Congress, who are proving so unwilling to maintain this funding. I get the sense that opposition to the funding amongst congressional Republicans is, if anything, growing and hardening. And it's clear that on this issue, the Republicans in Congress reflect the general sentiments of people across the United States. So Burns almost certainly will have informed Zelensky about that. He will have explained to Zelensky that, especially with the competing demands from Israel, Ukraine now has to prepare itself for the reality that it is not going to get the levels of funding and military support from the United States and from the collective West that it did previously. And in light of that, in his own interests and in Ukraine's interests, it is now urgent for him to come to some kind of arrangement with the Russians to try at least to freeze the conflict or to do something of that kind. But to reiterate again, I don't think Burns is going to Kiev in order to try to get President Zelensky to agree to step down, and I don't think Burns is going to Kiev in order to facilitate a coup. One thing Burns might, however, additionally do is lean heavily on Zelensky to agree once more to hold those elections, those presidential elections in Ukraine early next year. It's been suggested that the elections should take place in March. That the United States is now increasingly exasperated by Zelensky and his dogmatic refusal to engage the Russians in any negotiations. That, I think, again, we can take as almost certainly true. They might not want an outright coup. They might not want to see tanks and armed men in the streets. They might not want to see signs of instability in Kiev, which could undermine what is left of Ukraine's war effort. But they probably do want Zelensky to go. But they will want him to go in an orderly, constitutional way by arranging an election which he will then lose. Now, of course, that is easier said than done. It might be that the election doesn't happen soon enough, for example, and it may be that Zelensky simply refuses to hold the elections. But if Burns is telling Zelensky that the elections must take place and that the United States insists upon it, I would not be surprised. And given the enormous leverage that the United States has, I would not be surprised if Zelensky agrees. So, in summary, a crisis in Kiev, of that I am sure, a political crisis which none of the forces there are strong enough to resolve, a crisis which creates more problems for the United States than solutions, and one which the United States wants to tamp down, at least for the moment, though potentially they do perhaps want to find some way of easing Zelensky out. In the meantime, these two partners, Zelensky and Zaluzhny, forced to continue this deeply unhappy marriage that exists between them, one in which, from time to time, people, it seems, get killed, as happened with the unfortunate man that got the birthday present of the grenades, one of which blew him up. But anyway, they are, for the moment, difficult though this must be, stuck with each other. That's my overall view about the situation in Ukraine. Now, I've discussed about how Zaluzhny and Zelensky might be stuck with each other. I ought to say that I think that even whilst the United States perhaps would like Zelensky to quit the scene, though in an orderly and apparently constitutional way, I suspect that they would not be entirely sorry if they could see the back of General Zaluzhny as well. He has also, as I said, previously been playing this double game with President Zelensky, but he's been playing this double game with the Americans also. He's been going around telling everybody that Ukraine has not received all the weapons it was promised. This is why the offensive didn't turn out as well as expected, that they need fighter jets and ATACMS aircrafts and all of these things. And Zaluzhny's criticism has now given rise to a whole current of commentary that is now appearing in the media in the United States and in Britain, driven by hardline neocons, which says that the reason why Ukraine is losing this war is because the United States, President Biden himself, were supposedly late and slow in providing Ukraine with the weapons it needed. Had President Biden ignored Russian red lines, provided Ukraine with fighter jets and ATACMS missiles and Abrams tanks right from the first day, then victory would have been achieved. Now, that kind of commentary must be infuriating to the administration, which has in fact gone out of its way to supply huge amounts of weapons to Ukraine, stripping the United States and its European allies of critical quantities of weapons, especially ammunition, that they need for their own armed forces. And they must be furious that this narrative is starting to gain hold. And it's perhaps not surprising why they might be blaming General Zaluzhny for all of this, and why beyond that they must be deeply frustrated by what they will no doubt also see as the failures of his generalship, his inability to deliver the victories that he promised. And we also see now reports starting to circulate, which essentially circulate in the West, which seem to be targeted at him. So we've had this very strange, curious story about this Ukrainian colonel. There's a photograph appeared of him. He looks a rather unhappy and unimpressive looking man. Anyway, this Ukrainian colonel rather, who supposedly masterminded the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines on Zaluzhny's orders. And the interesting point here is why this story has appeared now. Note that it has appeared in the Western media, not, I understand. It didn't apparently originate in the media in Ukraine. The colonel himself, by the way, has denied this story entirely. He says it is completely untrue, to say. But why has it appeared now? Again, I can't help but think that even if some people in the West and the United States want to see President Zelensky step down, they wouldn't be sorry to see General Zaluzhny go also. And I think this is another, as I said, chip in this image of him, of General Zaluzhny, that has been created up to now. Anyway, all of this is very interesting. All of this is very exciting. As I said, it got everybody very excited yesterday. These rumours of coups and plots and intrigues taking place in Kiev. But for the moment, things remain as they are, and we will see what William Burns, who's going to Kiev, is able to do. Now, one of the things I would say is that all of these rumours, plus the increasingly disastrous situation on the battlefronts, is spooking Ukraine's European allies. Now, they are far more deeply implicated in this crisis than I think they feel comfortable with. They sense that European opinion is now shifting decisively against them, and they're also becoming increasingly nervous about the fact that the United States is also cooling on its support for Ukraine. And we can see a whole series of what look like increasingly panicky statements coming out from European officials. So Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, says that Ukraine, the situation for Ukraine is becoming increasingly difficult, but nonetheless, the West must continue to support Ukraine because it is necessary for Ukraine to achieve victory, and so that is what Stoltenberg has said, and his actual words. So this is at a EU Foreign Affairs Council meeting in Brussels. Notice this is the NATO Secretary General speaking to an EU Council meeting. He said the situation on the battlefield is difficult, and that just makes it even more important that we sustain and step up our support for Ukraine, because we cannot allow President Putin to win. Ukraine must prevail as a sovereign and independent nation in Europe, and it's in our interest to support Ukraine. And Germany, the government there, has got itself into a deep hole as a result of their decisions to destroy the very lucrative relationship that had existed between Germany and Russia. They got themselves into a potential position where they could be severely criticized because of that. So they are alarmed about the situation also. The German Defense Minister, Boris Pistorius, is now saying that there's no real possibility of the EU supplying Ukraine with all the shells that it promised, the million shells that it promised. It seems that Ukraine might not get much more than half of those shells. And anyway, Germany, therefore, however, they must also go on supporting Ukraine, and they're going to double the amount of support for Ukraine, even though they got fewer and fewer weapons that they can send to Ukraine. And that, of course, is what Ukraine primarily needs. And the EU High Representative for Foreign Policy, Josep Borrell, has recently also been speaking along the same sort of lines. Europe cannot afford to allow Russia to win in Ukraine, and therefore it must continue and indeed even further intensify its support. To repeat a point I've made many times, if Ukraine is defeated, if the Russians say take Kiev or force Ukraine to submit to their terms, it would be a very severe blow to the United States and to its global prestige as the country that still claims to be the world's primary superpower. But it would be an absolute disaster for Europe. It would mean that the European hope of using American power to solve Europe's ancient issue with Russia, its so-called Russia problem, before the United States perhaps withdraws completely from the European scene and starts focusing more on its own domestic problems and perhaps the challenge from China in the Far East. It would mean that that had failed. Far from the Russia problem being solved in the way that the Europeans would like, with Russia defeated and pushed back and possibly even broken up. On the contrary, Russia would be back more powerful perhaps than ever, at least relative to other European countries, once more on Europe's eastern border, once more overshadowing Europe, and that for them, after all the trouble and hard work to support Ukraine that they've gone through, would, for the European leaders who have brought about that outcome, that would be a disaster. So, as they sense that the Americans are slipping away, as they sense that the situation in Europe, in Ukraine itself, is deteriorating, as they sense that divisions within Europe itself are increasing. Prime Minister Fico of Slovakia has just announced that Slovakia will cease from now any further military supplies to Ukraine. It's perhaps unsurprising that these European politicians who have invested so much in this project are now running around rather like headless chickens, saying that they're going to double down on what they have already done without, however, offering any explanation of how doing more than what they have done can possibly succeed, given that it didn't succeed before, given the military realities on the battlefield, and the likely exit from this conflict before long of the United States. So there we are. Now, what exactly is going on the battlefronts? Now, yesterday was a day of lots and lots of news. And again, the major focus is on Avdeyevka. And there were lots of reports that the Russians have advanced in various places around Avdeyevka, including the southern pincer, which is gradually encircling Avdeyevka. Supposedly it has entered, and the Russians there have entered and captured a part of the southern industrial zone near Avdeyevka, once again gradually constricting Ukrainian defences in Avdeyevka, tightening the trap around Avdeyevka. And there have also been reports of the Russians making further bigger advances in Kupiansk and in Bakhmut as well. As I said, there was a cascade of reports yesterday about the Russians making all sorts of advances in all sorts of places. And our old friend Vladimir Rogov, for example, has come forward and has said that in Pyatikhatki, our guys have advanced 500 to 600 meters in the Vasilyevskoye direction in a day. So in Pyatikhatki, there's been reports that this village, that the Russians have re-entered this village, which has been in the grey zone for some time, just like they've re-entered Klashayevka, and that they're advancing there too. And even in that one place where Ukraine appeared to be holding the initiative, which was on the Dnieper River, this small village of Kinki, where a small group of Ukrainian soldiers were holding out in some buildings. Well, even there, over the last couple of hours, one gets the sense that the mood has shifted, that the Ukrainian troops who are clinging on to Kinki are coming under extreme pressure, that Ukraine has been forced to pull out all of the Marines who had been stationed in Kyiv and replace them with soldiers from a less experienced unit, and that they're suffering incredibly high casualties holding on to this bridgehead. And I've even seen one report, which of course I can't corroborate, that they suffer, Ukrainian troops who go to Kyiv suffer around 30% casualties. That it's not quite a death sentence, but suffice to say that one's prospects, if one is sent to Kyiv, become very low. And one senses that all of these moves, all of these steps that the Russians are taking in Avdeyevka, in Zaporozhye, in Bakhmut, in Kupiansk, they're not the big hammer blow that is to come. That is still in preparation. Again, there's lots of reports about the Russians assembling this vast number of cruise missiles. This is probably true. The production of cruise missiles in Russia is surging. The Ukrainians claim that the Russians now have around 1,000 cruise missiles stockpiled, more than they had at the start of their winter missile offensive last year. I'm sure that they do, by the way. And there's been lots of concerns expressed that the Russians have not been launching strategic cruise missiles for about 2.5 months, and people are worrying and trying to guess what that all means and why this stockpile is being built up and what it's being built up for. And the assumption is that it's going to lead to another huge offensive against Ukraine's energy system. I'm going to say straight away, by the way, I'm far from convinced that is the case, actually. As I said previously, the purpose of Russia's offensive against the Ukrainian energy system last year was not to knock out Ukraine's energy system, which the Russians could have done. It was to deplete Ukraine's air defense system, which they managed very successfully, which is why Russia's air force is now so much more active on the battlefronts. So I'm not sure why the Russians would want to go after the energy system this winter, given that what they sought to achieve last winter, they achieved. But it could be that the Russians are going to use these missiles for some other purpose, and I'm not going to try to predict what that might be. But anyway, there is an almost universal assumption that there is going to be a huge Russian advance eventually, that all of this pressure on the front lines is causing accelerating attrition, that Ukrainian defenses are crumbling, and that the time, Ukraine's time, is rapidly running out. And of course, this is both true, and it is the reason for the political crisis in Kiev, and it is the reason for the growing doubts in the United States, and it is the reason for the nerves and the panic that we see in Europe. But I don't myself see how that can change. And I've also said that it is pointless expecting Ukraine, with its present increasingly fragile political system, to try to conduct negotiations with Russia. Even if Zaluzhny, say, replaces Zelensky, why should he be in a better position to negotiate with the Russians than Zelensky is? The only parties that can now achieve some kind of a settlement that would end the war are the Western powers, if they contact the Russians. That would require President Biden, and it can only be him, to finally face up to the consequences of what he did when he sabotaged that peace that was in prospect last year and perhaps instigated the war in the first place. And that would require President Biden to pick up the phone and talk seriously to President Putin about some kind of long-term solution to the problem that Ukraine has presented, which would mean accepting that Ukraine will not join NATO and perhaps open the way for a further discussion about the general security situation in Europe. But absent that, I cannot see how negotiations can take place. And though it would be politically very difficult for this administration to do that, I think that in order to avoid this debacle in Ukraine, perhaps, well, in fact, definitely, that is what they should do. But bluntly, I don't think that that is what they are, in fact, going to do. So there we go. A gathering political crisis in Ukraine, a gathering military crisis in Ukraine, a procurement and funding crisis in Europe, divisions on the topic of Ukraine in the United States, all pointing to one inevitable outcome: a final military victory for Russia, one in which the Russians decide the terms. Anyway, that is my discussion about the Ukrainian conflict today. Now, there's been less in terms of recent news from the situation in the Middle East. To reiterate again, there are two simultaneous crises underway in the Middle East going on at one and the same time. One is this crisis in Gaza, which is the one that is attracting the global attention. The other is the crisis between the United States and the various Islamic militias, which is also raging across the Middle East. The fighting has been taking place between the US forces and these militias. It's not entirely clear how that fighting is going, but in any event, it does appear to be taking place. And as I discussed in my program, my most recent program, my impression is that this fighting is now escalating. But there does seem to be some movement politically connected with the situation in Gaza. Now, for the moment, the Israeli forces have not stormed any of the hospital buildings that they have been approaching. They've not attempted, for example, to storm the Al-Shifa hospital that they're so close to. And instead, we're getting reports now that appearing not just in the media in the Middle East, but also in places like the Wall Street Journal and most specifically in Reuters, that there are now serious negotiations underway, apparently to some extent supported by the United States, but brokered by various international organizations, between the Israeli authorities and Hamas, for a 5-day ceasefire and for an exchange of prisoners. Hamas would release, the talk is, around 70 hostages, principally women and children, and in return Israel would release various Palestinian prisoners, again from what I can understand, principally women. And there's some suggestions that 200 Palestinians might be released in return for the release of these 70 hostages. Now, I'm not certain that these discussions will bear fruit. I would suspect that they will meet intense opposition in Israel itself, including from within the Israeli cabinet. There will be many people in Israel who will see a ceasefire, even a 5-day ceasefire, a temporary ceasefire, negotiated on these kind of terms as a major political defeat for Israel. And they will say that Hamas will have achieved one of its stated objectives when it launched its attack on the 7th of October. One of those objectives being the release of Palestinian prisoners. And of course they will also have obtained a ceasefire, even if only a temporary ceasefire. And they will be right. Those people in Israel, within the cabinet, who say these things, will be right. But I suspect that the political pressure now, both domestically within Israel and from the United States, especially from the administration, is now becoming so strong that I would not be surprised myself if at some point over the next couple of days we saw some kind of temporary ceasefire of this kind and an exchange of prisoners take place. And as I have said already, as night follows day, the temporary ceasefire that is then imposed, the pressure will grow to convert that temporary ceasefire into a permanent ceasefire, and conceivably, eventually, that will happen, in which case I suspect that this whole affair will revert back to the United Nations, where arguably it should have been, to which it should have been taken in the first place, and we will see what happens next. But, of course, in that event, Hamas will not have been destroyed. It will remain standing. It will remain the dominant political force in Gaza. And I think at that point, Prime Minister Netanyahu's position in Israel will become completely untenable. Now, I've seen a report which I'm not able to confirm, I haven't seen confirmation of it, that some members of his own Likud party are now considering proposing a vote of no confidence in him. Of course, if that happens, then his political position, or so it seems to me, will collapse very rapidly anyway. So, if we get to that point, then it will confirm my belief that the whole military operation that was being launched in Gaza was politically misconceived as a military operation. Perhaps in time it would have worked, but politically, as I've discussed many times, the problems with it are overwhelming. Well, that's one piece of news about the situation in the Middle East. It could be that one of the reasons that the United States might be pressing Israel to moderate its position, and there's been many statements now coming from US officials that they want to see less damage to buildings, less deaths to civilians, less fire damage, all of that kind of thing, is that the United States has faced mounting criticism from powerful Muslim states. President Biden recently hosted in Washington the president of Indonesia, one of the world's biggest Muslim countries. Indonesia is a country the United States is keen to win over in its contest with China. And the president of Indonesia came to the United States in order to seal an agreement for a strategic partnership. And indeed, statements have been made by the two presidents, by the Indonesian president and President Biden, that Indonesia and the United States do now have a strategic partnership with each other. But it seems that in private, the president of Indonesia was extremely critical about US policy in the Middle East and made it very clear to the Americans that he wants it to change. He impresses me, incidentally, as, again, a sophisticated player on the international scene. He wants his strategic partnership with the United States because obviously Indonesia, a rising country whose economy has been growing rapidly, a country that wants to develop, wants a good economic relationship with the United States. But at the same time, rather like Vietnam, he has been keen to keep on good relations, or at least stable relations, with the Chinese and on friendly relations with the Russians. So he plays a sophisticated game, and of course criticism of American policy in the Middle East is a part of it. In his own self-interest and in Indonesia's interests, it makes sense for him to make that kind of criticism, if only to reassert Indonesia's own independence from the United States and to push the Americans to make decisions which the Indonesian public would approve of. Now, this visit by the President of Indonesia happens in advance of the meeting between President Biden of the United States and President Xi Jinping in San Francisco on Wednesday. And that could very well turn out to be a relatively fraught meeting. For the moment, at least, there does seem to be some effort to try to stabilize the relationship between China and the United States. But my own reading of the Chinese media is that the Chinese, for their part, have little expectation of a long-term improvement in relations between China and the United States. And a report I saw in, of all places, the BBC, explains why. Because even as the United States is keen to try to re-establish some kind of dialogue with China and has worked incredibly hard to try to get this meeting between Biden and Xi Jinping up and running, it seems that the United States is also stepping towards agreeing to a $10 billion arms package for Taiwan. Now, this is not a case of Taiwan buying weapons from the United States. It is a case more of Taiwan receiving a $10 billion American military assistance package. And the purpose of it would be to strengthen Taiwan's ground forces, its army. It's accepted, apparently, that Taiwan is now comprehensively outmatched by China, by sea and by air. There is no realistic way that that can be changed. So the Taiwanese army must now, therefore, be built up, and it must be built up with modern weapons supplied by the United States. Now, it's difficult to imagine anything that the United States could do which would be more likely to provoke China than that. One of the causes, in fact, a major cause of the Ukraine war, it was that the United States covertly, as it now turns out, was supplying weapons to Ukraine long before the present conflict in Ukraine started. In fact, I've received one fairly reliable, in fact very reliable, private report which says that the United States started to send weapons covertly, American weapons, covertly to Ukraine, even whilst President Obama was still president, and despite President Obama's stated policy of not supplying weapons to Ukraine. So the United States was doing all of that with Ukraine. I remember commentaries from Russian officials that the US was stuffing Ukraine with weapons. I remember these commentaries getting ever stronger and over the course of 2021. I discounted them to some extent because I wasn't aware of the extent of these weapons deliveries. And they were, as I said, one of the major factors that ultimately provoked the war. Well, the United States, it seems, is incapable of learning from that lesson. They're preparing to do the same thing all over again with Taiwan. Why they imagine that it would have a different outcome? Why a policy which, far from deterring Russia, provoked Russia into the military operation that it launched? Why they think that in the case of Taiwan, it would deter China instead of provoking China, when, as I said, in the case of Ukraine, it turned out otherwise. Anyway, I can't think, but it's become obvious to me that the present American government finds it all but impossible to change or adjust its policies. So, I am sure that President Xi Jinping has been briefed by his officials about this BBC report, about this $10 billion arms package that the United States is preparing for Taiwan. I am sure that Xi Jinping will bring it up in his discussions with President Biden. I'm sure that President Biden, as he always does, will either evade discussion of the issue or perhaps give a flat denial. And I am sure that all that will happen as a result, when this arms package does begin to materialize, is that the Chinese will feel yet again that the US president has deliberately deceived them. So, anyway, there we go. Difficult talks between the United States and China coming. But if we come back to the issue of the Middle East, I can very well understand why President Biden, why the United States, which has worked very hard to get the president of Indonesia to come to Washington and agree a strategic partnership with the United States on the eve of a summit meeting between the US president and the Chinese president, would not want to anger and infuriate the Indonesian president by rejecting his urgent requests for some kind of ceasefire or at least moderation of the scale of the fighting in the Middle East and in Gaza. That is the nature of diplomacy. That is how diplomacy is conducted. And that is how pressure, real pressure, is applied. And I suspect that over time it will have greater cumulative effect, and at some point over the next few weeks and months, some kind of ceasefire in Gaza might finally take effect. Well, that's the end of my programme for today. There'll be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and by going to our shop, links under this video also. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. More from me soon. Have a very good day.